The dual monarchy of England and France existed during the latter phase of the 100 Years' War, when Charles VII of France and Henry VI of England disputed the succession to the throne of France. It commenced on the 21st of October 1422 upon the death of King Charles VI of France, who had signed the Treaty of Troyes, which gave the French crown to his son-in-law Henry V of England and Henry's heirs. It excluded King Charles's son, the Dauphin Charles, who by right of primogeniture was the heir to the Kingdom of France. Although the treaty was ratified by the Estates General of France, the act was a contravention of the French law of succession, which decreed that the French crown could not be alienated. Henry VI, son of Henry V, became king of both England and France, and was recognized only by the English and Burgundians until 1435 as King Henry II of France. He was crowned King of France on 16 December 1431. In practical terms, King Henry's de jure sovereignty and legitimacy as King of France was only recognized in the English and Allied-controlled territories of France, which were under the domination of his French Regency Council, while the Dauphin ruled as King of France in part of the realm south of the Loire. The Dauphin was crowned as King Charles VII of France at Reims on 17 July 1429, largely through the martial efforts of Joan of Arc, who believed it was her mission to free France from the English and to have the Dauphin Charles crowned at Reims. In 1435, the Duke of Burgundy, released from his obligations to Henry VI by a papal legate, recognized Charles VII as the rightful King of France. The defection of this powerful French noble marked the end of Henry's de facto reign over France. The dual monarchy came to an end with the final victory of the French at the Battle of Castillon on 17 July 1453, thus bringing the 100 Years' War to a conclusion. The English were expelled from all of the territories which they had controlled in France, with the sole exception of Calais. Charles VII had thus established himself as the undisputed king of almost all of France. Background: the English and French had been constantly at war over hereditary sovereignty in France. The 100 Years' War escalated, and the conflict between the two nations reached its peak in an intermittent series of belligerent phases, with each phase usually ending with a temporary truce lasting for a few years. In the first phase, Edward III won some extraordinary victories against the French, most notably at Creacut, Cy and Sluys. His son Edward, the Black Prince, also captured the French King John II at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, and routed the French army. The year 1360 marked the end of the first phase and an opportunity for peace. In the Treaty of Bretagne, the French king was ransomed for an amount equal to twice the French kingdom's gross. In addition, the French granted Edward III an extended Aquitaine, thus restoring one of the main duchies of the previous Angevin Empire. Edward III was, however, forced to give up his title as the rightful king to the throne of France, this claim being based on his mother, Isabella. Charles V ascended to the throne, and in 1369 hostilities were reopened by the French declaring war, thus breaking the treaty. This time they led to embarrassing strategic defeats for the English side. Charles's strategy was to attack the castles, where English victories were less certain. The English, now on the defensive, lost more territory, but retained Gascony. By now, Edward was aging and no longer fit to lead in battle. His son, the Prince of Wales, predeceased him by a year, and so when Edward III died in 1377 it was his grandson Richard II who became king. There was another truce in 1396 when Richard II married Isabella of Valois, a daughter of King Charles VI of France, thus marking the end of the second phase. Peace did not last long, however, as, in 1399, Henry IV usurped Richard's throne while Richard was away in Ireland, thus provoking French hostility in 1403, which marked the beginning of the third phase of the war. The House of Lancaster and Anglo-French relations. In the beginning, Henry claimed he was retrieving his confiscated region of Lancaster, and wrote to Richard that he had no wish or right to depose your highness as king. Henry, nevertheless, remained firmly on the throne, and Richard II was deposed. Internal strife reached its climax during his reign, with the rebellions of Owen Glendarran of the Percy family in the north. Henry, however, was least involved politically. Civil war was raging in France, especially between the parties of Armagnac and the Burgundians. Charles VI's brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, was assassinated on the order of the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless. This was largely due to a scandalous affair with the Duchess of Burgundy, which started as a rumor but would later involve Charles VII. Henry IV was considered a key ally during the Civil War. The Armagnacs even offered to give back the Duchy of Aquitaine in support of military services. Although Aquitaine was forgotten when the Armagnacs won, Henry sent an expeditionary force in 1412 to aid them. The Civil War continued with persecution on both sides. The sack of Soissons by the Armagnacs and the control of Paris by the Burgundians. John the Fearless claimed to be the regent of the young Dauphin Charles and the insane King Charles VI. Henry IV, the usurper, died in 1413. His son, Henry, was still in his mid-20s when he became king, the warrior king. The main feature of Henry IV's reign in England was internal strife and rebellion, and as a result, Henry V took part in battles from an early age. His first test in battle was in the Welsh Wars. Henry fought at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. He took a Welsh arrow in the lower part of his face, it passed through his jaw and out the other side. Henry's knights were charging the Welsh positions, so in spite of his wound, Henry refused to leave the field and the English won the day. Henry would employ the English and Welsh archers on a massive scale in his campaign at Agincourt. Upon the death of Henry IV, Thomas, Duke of Clarence, was supported as the heir rather than Henry. The Dauphin was made Duke of Guyenne, which was English Gascony, as the Armagnacs wanted Gascony back under their own sovereignty. Clarence was to lead the English in Gascony, not Henry. This would give him a chance to take the throne of England. While Clarence was away in Gascony, Henry V took the throne. Henry had also successfully fended off the Dauphin's designs on the Guyenne region. As Henry started his reign in 1413, and the Civil War in France was still on, Henry demanded that the King of France give him back an extended Aquitaine, Normandy, the ports of Provence, the old county of Toulouse, which was vassal to the Angevin Empire, and the provinces of Maine and Anjou. The French refused to accept his demands, and they ignored his claims. In 1415, at the age of 28, Henry began his invasion of France, which would culminate in the Battle of Agincourt. 1415 campaign. On the 11th of August 1415, Henry sailed for France, where his forces besieged the fortress at Harfleur, capturing it on the 22nd of September. Afterwards, Henry had to march with his army across the French countryside towards Calais. On the 25th of October 1415, on the plains near the village of Agincourt, he turned to engage a pursuing French army in battle. Despite his men-at-arms being exhausted and outnumbered, Henry led his men into battle, decisively defeating the French, who died in the thousands. Most of those taken prisoners were slaughtered by order of Henry, who spared only the most illustrious. This victorious conclusion, from the English viewpoint, was only the first step in the campaign. People of England, cease your work and pray for the glorious victory of Crispin's day. Despite their scorn for Englishmen's renown, the odious might of France came crashing down. This Latin epigram was one of many produced after the battle and came from a long tradition of such work in chronicles. 1417 campaign. So, with those two potential enemies gone, and after 2 years of patient preparation following the Agincourt, Henry renewed the war on a larger scale in 1417. Lower Normandy was quickly conquered, and Rouen cut off from Paris and besieged. The French were paralyzed by the disputes between the Burgundians in the Armagnacs. Henry skillfully played them off one against the other, without relaxing his warlike approach. In January 1419, Rouen fell. The Norman French who had resisted were severely punished. Alain Blanchard, who had hung English prisoners from the walls, was summarily executed. Robert de Livet, canon of Rouen, who had excommunicated the English king, was sent to England and imprisoned for 5 years. By August, the English were outside the walls of Paris. The intrigues of the French parties culminated in the assassination of John the Fearless by the Dauphin's partisans at Montereau. Philip the Good, the new duke, and the French court threw themselves into Henry's arms. After 6 months of negotiation, the Treaty of Troyes recognized Henry as the heir and regent of France, and, on the 2nd of June 1420, Henry married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI of France. From June to July, Henry's army besieged and took the castle at Montereau, then Melun in November, returning to England shortly thereafter. Henry VI was born the following year. 1421 campaign. On the 10th of June 1421, Henry sailed back to France for what would be his last military campaign. From July to August, his forces besieged and captured Dreux, thus relieving Allied forces at Chartres. That October, his forces lay siege to Meaux, capturing it on the 2nd of May 1422. Henry V died suddenly on the 31st of August 1422 at the Château de Vincennes near Paris, apparently from dysentery, which he had contracted during the siege of Meaux. He was 35 years old. Before his death, Henry V had named his brother John, Duke of Bedford, regent of France in the name of his son Henry VI, then only a few months old. Henry V did not live to be crowned King of France himself, as he might confidently have expected after the Treaty of Troyes, as the sickly Charles VI, whose heir he had been named, survived him by 2 months. His son Henry, who was born the year before, succeeded his father as King Henry VI of England and, 6 months later, his maternal grandfather as King of France. 1422. The question of regent upon French succession. After Henry V's death, the issue of the regency to the infant King Henry VI was resolved by meetings between Bedford, Burgundy and the French Estates General. The settlement of Troyes was reaffirmed. In accordance with it, Bedford was made keeper of Normandy and Burgundy and may have been named regent for the King of France. Bedford was a little uncertain whether Burgundy would relinquish his status as keeper of Normandy, so he wrote to London 5 days later to advertise his position as regent of England, then of France. Bedford had no reason to contradict Henry V, but if he could not be regent for his French king, he would be as his English regent. At the time, Bedford was still referring to himself as Gouvernator Normandy, Governor of Normandy. On the 1st of November, 6 days after the letter was dispatched to London, Bedford started to emerge as French regent for his nephew King Henry VI of England and France. At the same time, the Treaty of Troyes was reaffirmed, and on the 19th of November Bedford presided as French regent in the Parlement de Paris and dedicated himself to be working for the good of France. Henry VI was also now King of France, united with Normandy and Gascony by the Treaty of Troyes, passed directly to the French King Charles VI. When Henry VI of England succeeded to the French crown in 1422, it was included as part of the jurisdiction. The Duke of Bedford was content and he made no appeal to return to England, returning only in 1425 to England in an urgent meeting with Bishop Henry Beaufort. Philip of Burgundy could hardly resist English wishes, for he needed their support after the murder of his father, John the Fearless, by the henchmen of the Dauphin. Henry V's arrangements had one fatal flaw. Not until the last few days of his life had he thought he would predecease Charles VI. Moreover, the treaty had restricted Henry's freedom on his deathbed. The arrangements he had made were to cover the short term and the long term. This is a major reason for Burgundy's alliance with England and the steadfastness of English commanders to the battlefield. Charles VI's death had in no way affected the Anglo-Burgundian alliance or the legal dual monarchy of England and France. Monstrelet the Burgundian is the only contemporary to record that Burgundy backed down to the regency to the French king in order to have Bedford as regent. He claimed to record Henry V's last words on his deathbed, and also the content of the recorded speech. It made an insult to Gloucester by further saying Henry had maintained the regency of England to Exeter. The Chronicle, however, was written after Gloucester's invasion of the Low Countries in 1425, which provoked Burgundy's hostility, and after Gloucester repelled Duke Philip's attack on Calais in 1436. This was a distortion of fact. Monstrelet was trying to heighten Burgundian self-esteem and to explain why Burgundy dropped the regency in 1422. The St. Albans chronicler recorded that Burgundy was never entrusted with the regency of France. However, his work ends 6 weeks before Charles VI's death and mentions nothing beyond that. Henry V may have not inquired about any specific region for France, but Bedford was unopposed. English regency. Henry V's wish that Gloucester be appointed regent for England was controversial, and not clear in any sense that there was any named candidate to adopt the regency to England. On the 7th of November 1422, which was the day of Henry V's solemn burial at Westminster, Dukes of Gloucester and Exeter and Bishop Beaufort studied the attached last wills of Henry. There was some agreement on the authority of the dead king's wishes, but until all of Henry's directions were carried out, there was still going to be objections to Humphrey. John, Duke of Bedford, unsure of his future in France, issued an objection to Humphrey's regency on the 26th of November. Some lords supported the idea of Gloucester as regent because of his youth and his emerging reputation. However, most of the lords still disliked the idea and expressed great misgivings about the powers which were later to be bestowed upon him by the Codicil of 1422. Gloucester realized the idea of using history or precedent. In 1216, the first English minority since the Norman conquest was upheld, and later, William Marshal, 1st Earl of Pembroke, who was rector to King Henry III while the latter was in his minority. He wanted to have the same authority but as wardship to the young king. The Lords countered that this precedent was too far back in time, and furthermore Richard II was in his minority as king, but John of Gaunt was given no specific position in the council. They ruled with general consensus between the gentry rather than a single rector to the king. Bedford was rector of France because a single regent was favoured in France rather than a ruling council, and the dual monarchy existed through a personal union, and each kingdom is allowed with their own traditions and customs. The Lords did not want to attack Humphrey personally in his pretensions to regent, but rather the will itself. They denied that Henry V had any right to determine the governance of England or of disposing of any royal land. The will itself was too inclined to Roman law and rather heavily foreign to the English. It was said Gloucester's keepership was made forfeit by Henry's death. Gloucester was given a blow and was only to act in affairs by council permission as well as by opening and closing Parliament. However, it was not the only drawback, and since Bedford was heir to the throne of France as well as to that of England, if he returned from France he would take Gloucester's position as head regent with the permission of council temporarily until he withdrew back to his regency in France. Gloucester's position was severely limited in England, but both realms were to benefit for the time being. The French realm, staying in the offensive and maintaining French possessions, meant that the English navy was now a second defence. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes achieved political stability, as did the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. In 1423, the alliance further included John VI, Duke of Brittany. The English, under Thomas Montacute, 4th Earl of Salisbury, were moving towards the Loire by 1428. In the 1420s, Gascony had received no harm from any of the Valois attempts to capture the area, as it was isolated by both sea and land from the northern French territories. Gascony was largely protected by French nobles sympathetic to the English cause, and there were negotiations with the Languedoc gentry, such as the Count of Foix. Calais was protected by its garrison and local merchant community, which exported wool to northern Europe and England and making good commercial relations with the Low Countries. Normandy and the Ile-de-France region was protected by the French Regent and Reims by the Duke of Burgundy. The only sensitive part was in the Channel, where Anglo-Breton relations and attitudes affected the safekeeping of southwestern English waters and the passing of ships to Gascony. The Duke of Brittany's allegiance to the dual monarchy under the Protectorate of Bedford was preserved through his abiding aim to preserve the independence of his duchy. Arthur de Richemont, a Breton nobleman, at first supported Henry V in the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, and he was created Count of Touraine by the English, but soon gave allegiance to Charles VII when Yolande of Aragon made him Constable of France. As the English were moving into Valois territory, relations with Brittany started to deteriorate in 1424, and when open war was declared, the Estates General took precautions against Breton raiders on the coast. Relations with Burgundy were much more important for English commerce. Like Jean V, Philip also had other political wishes. One of his greatest concerns was Burgundian influence in the Low Countries. After Jacqueline of Hainault's flight to England in 1421 from her husband John of Brabant, she married Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, in 1423. This quickly caused English intervention in 1424 when Jacqueline's uncle and enemy made the Duke of Burgundy his heir. The outcome was Gloucester's disastrous campaign to Hainault. Bedford came to shore up the alliance on which his power depended. Channel naval protection was not a concern, even after Burgundy switched its support at Arras. In the late 1420s, coastal areas like Devon and the Isle of Wight suffered some military engagements against Breton raiders. Bedford himself relied heavily on English financial aid to support his armies on the Norman frontiers. Local revenue from Normandy, Gascony and Calais was used for expected naval defense, fortifications and garrisons in France.